Hey y'all, 250 years ago, on July 15th, 1775, what ends up being known as the Beeline March got started. Now what this was is essentially a race between the two companies of Virginia riflemen that Congress authorized to go to Boston. Now after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress, just a couple days before the Battle of Bunker Hill happens, the Second Continental Congress authorizes the creation of 10 independent rifle companies. And by independent, that just means that they are independent of the states. It's not a state militia. They're not beholden to the states, meaning they're under the Continental Congress. And this is the creation of the Continental Army, and therefore the creation of the U.S. Army. Anyway, they authorized 10 companies, and 6 of them are to come from Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. 2 of the companies are to come from Maryland, and 2 companies from Virginia. And the 6 companies from Pennsylvania, the recruiting is so high there, they end up being authorized. Pennsylvania's authorized 8 companies, and then still more people want to go, so they get 9 companies of riflemen, and they're gonna all end up together becoming the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment eventually. The 2 companies from Virginia, though, they've got the farthest to go to get to Boston, and one of those companies is going to be mustered on June 21st, 1775, in, at the time, what was Mecklenburg, Virginia. It's now Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is a really nice little town. If you get a chance to go there, I'd recommend it. There's a great little general store there that I've gotten a couple things from. But anyway, they're mustered in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. This is the Berkeley County. At the time is Berkeley County, Virginia. They're going to muster a company of 100 riflemen under a Captain Hugh Stephenson. And on June 22nd, in the neighboring Frederick County, Virginia, at what's still Winchester, Captain Daniel Morgan is going to muster his company of riflemen. And they had agreed, Stephenson and Morgan had apparently agreed that they were going to meet each other, and that their companies would meet in Frederick, Maryland on, I think they had agreed July 17th, but Morgan and his company, like I say, they set out today, July 15th. They had a little bit further to go, but they went ahead and set out, and then of course Stephenson and his men, they figure out that Morgan's, well, I guess we're not meeting him. They're going ahead, well, you're not going to beat us there, and they start racing. And this is what ends up being called the Beeline March, is this race between the 2 Virginia rifle companies. And who were the men that formed these rifle companies? For the most part, there's not really 2 of them are 2 companies from Maryland, 2 from Virginia, and 6 and then 9 companies from Pennsylvania. They're all the western fringe, the frontier of the United Colonies. And being on the western frontier, all of these men, and this is why they wanted to recruit these riflemen from these places, all of them have, they pretty much, it's a way of life. They've grown up fighting Indians. They've grown up in the woods. If they're on the frontier, then they've been fighting Indians, and it's not what you're going to see in the westerns with the Plains Indians and stuff. Is a very different kind of fighting from what was going on in Europe before this. But the Indians were on the East Coast were masters of woodland fighting, and that's what these guys that formed the rifle companies. They've been fighting. A lot of them have, at some point or another, have lived with Indians. They've been fighting Indians. they end up resembling, at least, you know, compared to, say, fancy English gentlemen, they're going to look a lot more like, they're across the board, they're going to be more like the Indians. All this to say, it ends up being, they have quite the fanfare as they march to Boston. And not just the Virginia companies, but all of them, as they're making their way across Pennsylvania, or across Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and finally in New York, and finally Massachusetts. There's these people on the eastern seaboard, a lot of them, they've never left those cities or towns that they're in, or they've not gone that far. They certainly haven't been out on the frontier, because it's a very dangerous place to be. So when these riflemen come through, it's like a parade. They're not wearing your typical townspeople clothing. They're wearing their hunting shirts, which is linsey woolsey, just a rough fabric, and it's fringed around the neck, and some of them the sleeves are fringed, and they drop down, they go down almost to the knees. It's a very practical, their clothing is very practical, but they look strange to the people that are on the coast. They look strange, and they are strange, to put it mildly. They are strange. Most of them, they're rifle companies, so they're carrying rifles, and the difference there with the musket that most people are going to have at the time, or be familiar with, if anything, at the time, is a smoothbore musket. And a smoothbore musket's going to have, let's say, 50% accuracy at 100 yards. Rifles got like 50% accuracy at 300 yards. So the feats of marksmanship that these guys can pull off is, the people on the coast don't know what to think, kind of deal. Anyway, though, the Virginia companies, they set out, Captain Morgan, Daniel Morgan, sets out with his company on July 15th. Stephenson sets out July 17th. And they end up making this 600-mile march in just a little over 20 days. Do the math on it, they averaged over 20 miles a day for almost a month. Morgan arrives at Boston on the 8th of August of 1775, and Stephenson got there 3 days later on August 11th. That is quite the march. I mean, I don't think that we're not built like that anymore. To march 20-some miles a day, and it's not on roads. It's over rough terrain, or rough roads, if there are any. There's parts of it there certainly weren't. 20 miles, over 20 miles a day, though, every day for almost a month. I don't think we're not built like that anymore. So it's quite the feat that these guys accomplished, just to get to Boston. And on that note, I'll read. This is from Frank Moore's The Diary of the American Revolution. This, just to give some idea what the fanfare was like as these rifle companies made their way to Boston. August 7th, 1775, Pennsylvania. On Friday evening last, the 4th, arrived at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on their way to the American camp, Captain Cresap's company of riflemen. And this is one of the Maryland companies, Captain Cresap, consisting of 130 active, brave young fellows, many of whom have been in the late expedition under Lord Dunmore against the Indians. This is Lord Dunmore's war. The year before this, 1774, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he calls up the Virginia militia. They asked Pennsylvania if they would help, and Pennsylvania said no. So Lord Dunmore and the Virginia militia, they march west. They end up at what's called the Battle of Point Pleasant. If I'm not mistaken, it's on the Ohio River. But this was pretty much for control of the Ohio River Valley, and it really just kind of stuck a pin in it. But this happened right before the Revolutionary War is what we think of as Revolutionary War kicks off, Lord Dunmore's War. Anyway, most of these guys, what this saying is that most of these riflemen are veterans of Lord Dunmore's War. Like I said, if they weren't part of Lord Dunmore's War, chances are they've, at some point in their lives, they've been involved in fighting Indians somewhere or another, just because it happened almost all the time. Anyway, they bear in their bodies visible marks of their prowess and show scars and wounds which would do honor to Homer's Iliad. They show you, to use the poet's words, where the gored battle bled at every vein. One of these warriors in particular shows the cicatrices, which is just a fancy word for scars, of 4 bullet holes through his body. These men have been bred in the woods to hardships and dangers from their infancy. They appear as if they were entirely unacquainted with and had never felt the passion of fear. With their rifles in their hands, they assume a kind of omnipotence over their enemies. One cannot much wonder at this when we mention a fact which can be fully attested by several of the reputable persons who were eyewitness of it. 2 brothers in the company took a piece of board 5 inches broad and 7 inches long, with a bit of white paper about the size of $1 nailed in the center, and while one of them supported this board perpendicularly between his knees, the other, at the distance of upwards of 60 yards and without any kind of rest, shot 8 bullet holes through it successively and spared a brother's thigh. Another of the company held a barrel stave perpendicularly in his hands with one edge close to his side, while one of his comrades, at the same distance and in the same manner before mentioned, shot several bullets through it without any apprehension of danger on either side. The spectators, appearing to be amazed at these feats, were told that there were upwards of 50 persons in the same company could do the same thing, that there was not one who could not plug 19 bullets out of 20, as they termed it, within an inch of the head of a 10-penny nail. In short, to evince the confidence they possessed in their dexterity at these kind of arms, some of them proposed to stand with apples on their heads, while others at the same distance undertook to shoot them off. But the people who saw the other experiments declined to be witnesses of this. At night, a great fire was kindled. Just talking about their marksmanship. This was a thing that happened with the Beeline March, not just the Virginia companies, as I said, but all of them. As they're marching to Boston, it's like a big military parade. They're strange looking. Everybody's town is going to come out and see them, and then they're showboats. They're going to show off their marksmanship skills. You ever ask yourself, like, what did people do for entertainment before electricity, before the internet? You go look at these strange characters from out on the frontier in their funny clothes and wonder at how in the world they could ever be such good marksmen. Anyway, back to the book there. At night, a great fire was kindled around a pole planted in the courthouse square, where the company, with the captain at their head, all naked to the waist and painted like savages, except the captain, who was in an Indian shirt, indulged a vast concourse of people with a perfect exhibition of a war dance, and all the maneuvers of Indians, holding council, going to war, circumventing their enemies by defiles, ambuscades, attacking, scalping, etc. It is said by those who are judges that no representation could possibly come near the original. The captain's expertness and agility in particular in these experiments astonished every beholder. This morning they will set out on their march for Cambridge. Once they get to Boston, the rifle companies, Pennsylvania, of course, they get there first. They all, by the end of August, they're all up there. And one of the first things that they do is they start sniping. As the New England states, they've got the British Army pretty much hemmed in Boston. I mean, it's siege warfare. They're just looking at each other. And then these riflemen show up and they start sniping, and they actually start killing some of the British. Go to the diary of the American Revolution here. The riflemen from York County, Pennsylvania have annoyed the regulars very much. By a gentleman who left Boston yesterday, we hear that Captains Percival and Sabine of the Marines, Captain Johnson of the Royal Irish, and Captain Des Moines of the Train were killed on Monday. Captain Chetwynd, son of Lord Chetwynd, is mortally wounded. The number of privates killed this week we have not heard. The regulars have thrown up a breastwork across the neck at the foot of Bunker Hill to secure their sentries and advance guards. Yesterday, Captain Morgan arrived from Virginia with his company of riflemen, but they are grown so terrible to the mercenaries that nothing is to be seen from their breastworks but a hat. So, yeah, they start sniping when they get there, but within 2 weeks, the British have pretty much figured out that what's going on and that they should just keep their heads down, so they do. And they pretty much, the riflemen are, at that point, they're useless, because when they get up there, they're exempted from camp duties, from regular camp duties. They don't have to do what the militia and the regular soldiers have to do. They have special assignments, which means they're either fighting. What this pretty much ends up meaning is that they're either fighting or they're getting drunk and finding somebody to fight with. It's kind of the way that it goes. One of the fun stories that I found looking this stuff up is this was, I think, Captain Ross's, if I'm not mistaken, it was Captain Ross's company, Pennsylvania company of riflemen. Anyway, one of the sergeants in the company, he got arrested for something like murmuring about an officer, some silly shit. He gets arrested, put in jail, and 32 of the other riflemen apparently get drunk and load their rifles and say, we're going to go get him. And at that point, of course, everybody that's anywhere nearby knows what they're planning on doing. So word gets sent, and George Washington increased the guard. 32 riflemen say that they're going to go get their buddy out of jail. So George Washington increased the guard at the jail to 500 men and ordered them to load their muskets and fix bayonets. Just to give some idea of how terrified George Washington was of these the frontiersmen. But they end up there. Those guys were actually one of the other Pennsylvania rifle companies. Surround them and disarm them, and nothing ends up coming of it. Nothing really. I think they got to the jail and they released Sergeant, or somebody else got arrested too, and they released him, but they didn't release the first guy that was arrested. It got complicated, but they end up, nothing happens. Just funny, I think, that Washington hears 32 of them are coming and says it's going to take at least 500 of us, or 500 of the city boys, I guess, to stop them. Back to the Beeline March, though, and the two Virginia companies. So one of those companies, the Frederick Company mentioned, is headed by Captain Daniel Morgan. And he, of course, he's going to end up being a major player in the American Revolution, one of the heroes of the American Revolution. But with his company of riflemen, the next thing that he's going to end up doing, he's going to go with his company and two of the Pennsylvania rifle companies are going to be attached to the northern expedition, and they're going to go invade Canada at the end of the year. The other company, with Captain Hugh Stephenson, he's an interesting fellow, at least in what could have been. He apparently was captain or some kind of officer of militia during the French and Indian War and served under a Colonel Bouquet. I personally have not found much about yet, but he seems to have been a great Indian fighter. Stephenson supposedly served under him, and one of the most experienced military commanders available at the start of the war. He actually gets a recommendation from George Washington. This is found this in a letter from George Washington to John Hancock in March of 1776. Washington actually recommends Hugh Stephenson to be promoted from captain to lieutenant colonel, but it would have been lieutenant colonel of the Pennsylvania Rifle Regiment. Of course, that's not going to happen, so I believe his name was Captain James Chambers. He ends up getting promoted to lieutenant colonel instead. But Stephenson, he goes back to Virginia over the summer of 1776, and he gets sick and dies. That's how you probably never heard of him. He quite possibly could have been an American hero in the American Revolution, but like so many of the actually good commanders that we had, leaders that we had at the start of the war, there were a lot of them that were killed in the first year or two of the war, and Stephenson seems to have been one of those. Luckily, we got to keep Captain Daniel Morgan, though. He ends up, like I said, being a major player in the American Revolution.